Today, my name is Emily Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Institute here at the University of San Diego. And the Nonprofit Institute, we're very excited to be able to advocate for and champion the nonprofit sector through the work that we do at the university in developing research around nonprofits and philanthropy and quality of life issues in the San Diego region and other issues across California, as well as to develop leaders that are real change makers in our communities and to support and strengthen the capacity of nonprofit organizations and networks of organizations so that they can do the greatest change for social good across our regions. And we're very excited at the University of San Diego to be partnering with our fellow nonprofit centers across the country, including the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at UW-Madison, the Helen Bader Institute for Nonprofit Management at UW-Milwaukee, and the Nonprofit Center at LaSalle University. And this is part one of a two-part webinar series that our wonderful colleague, Pat Libby, will be offering. And we're so excited to welcome her here today. Pat Libby and I have a history because she is actually the founder of the Nonprofit Institute here at the University of San Diego. She was its first director, and she is a leading nonprofit consultant and one of our nation's leading experts in nonprofit advocacy and lobbying. And for that reason, we're very excited to have her talk to us today as part of this two-part webinar series of what it means and how you can do it as a nonprofit organization to really lean into the role of advocacy and lobbying in the work that you do. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Pat. And I will say, for those of you just joining us, if you can just share where you're calling in from, we're excited to have people from all over the country. So Pat, I will let you take it from here.
Great. Well, I am going to share my screen so that everyone can see what I'm talking about. And as Emily mentioned, this is a two-part series. And what we're going to focus on today is really how do we begin to have these conversations with our boards and senior staff about whether or not to engage in lobbying, and what does it look like? What are the rules? How does it function? Next week, I'm going to be talking about advocacy strategies and how laws get passed. So let's move forward. Okay. Except it's not moving forward. All right, here we go. So the reason I have a big 3 on this screen is because 3% of nonprofits in the United States are actively involved in lobbying. And when I say nonprofits, I'm talking very specifically about 501c3 corporations. So nonprofits like the Salvation Army or the Red Cross or community centers, hospitals, universities, those kinds of nonprofits. Only 3% are engaged in lobbying and advocacy. And my goal is to increase that number by tenfold. So the question is, why don't nonprofits do this? And the reason is because people are really scared. And the reason that they're scared is because they think, oh, we're going to lose our tax exempt status. It's so complicated. How does it really work to pass a law? It's going to cost a lot of money. And the thing that really bugs me the most is, how is this related to our mission? What does it really look like? So today we're going to talk about why advocacy is really central to the mission of every single nonprofit, how your organization should begin to think about it. What does it mean? How do we define advocacy and lobbying? What are the legal rules for nonprofits? And how should we fund it? And I saw that one of you had a question that popped up already about funding. Cynthia Fernandez is going to be my wing woman on the questions today. So feel free to submit questions as I go along in the chat box, and she will interrupt me as I go along. There should be time at the end if you want to ask additional questions. And I'm also really excited that the Nonprofit Institute is recording this session. Yay! So if you want to share what you've learned with other people, you'll be able to do that either by going on the Institute's website or on my website, which is patlibby.com. There are a lot of free resources on my website. So that will be available if you want to play it again, Sam, or share it with someone. Okay, so the first question is why? I said something pretty radical a few moments ago, at least I hope you thought it was radical, which is that every single nonprofit should engage in lobbying and advocacy. And the reason why is because it's related to your mission. And I want to start with an example that may seem far-fetched, which is, let's just take a symphony orchestra, for example. Why would a symphony have to engage in lobbying and advocacy? Well, last time I went to a concert, everybody who was in the audience pretty much was eligible for Medicare. And you look around and you think, what is the audience going to look like in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? And if there isn't music education in schools, if people don't know how to play an instrument or don't appreciate different kinds of music, then we can build the biggest concert halls on the planet and make them fancy and beautiful, but people won't come. So that's one example. I also want to give you another example of a fabulous nonprofit in San Diego, where I'm based, that's called Serving Seniors. And it is headed by a remarkable man named Paul Downing. And what they do is they provide nutritious meals, social services, affordable housing, social activities. They do all kinds of fabulous things. And they recently surveyed the people who use their services, and they discovered that many of them are having difficulty paying their rent and are paying more than 50% of their income on rent, which is unbelievable. Then they looked at homelessness surveys in San Diego County, and they found that 1 in 4 people who are homeless are 55 years of age or older, and 43% of those people are first-time homeless. So we have a problem, seniors not being able to afford their housing. So they came up with an idea. They wanted to start with a pilot program that the County of San Diego just approved, and it's going to be providing seniors with $500 rent subsidies, and this is to seniors who are paying 50% or more of their income for rent. And those subsidies are going to be going directly to the landlords. So that is a wonderful way that Serving Seniors is expanding its mission, because the honest truth is, no matter how much money nonprofit corporations are able to raise, government always has a lot more. So the work that we can do to affect resources and policy is just enormous. So where do you start? You want to start by forming some kind of a committee with, maybe it's a combination of board people and staff people, and you want to say, if we think about the people we are serving in our community, what are the most important issues they're facing? How can we improve their lives or our services through a change in public policy or allocating resources differently? What do we need to do? So that's the first step, is really thinking about it and thinking about how advocacy is directly related to your mission. So then the committee is going to talk, and they're going to say, okay, let's sort this out. And one of our first tasks is to learn the legal rules for nonprofit lobbying, because we know that people get really nervous about losing their tax exempt status and all these other things when they don't know the rules. So they want to learn the rules, and this is what they're going to learn. They're going to learn that it is 100% legal for a nonprofit 501c3 corporation to lobby. So the moment you receive your incorporation papers from the IRS, you are good to go. And that is a legal right that you have. Now, wait a minute. What do I mean by lobbying? Let's define it. So lobbying is attempting to influence legislation, and legislation is any law that's in the process of being made. Now, some of you receive, for example, community development block grant funds, and you might go to testify for those funds. And you think, well, that's not really lobbying because that's a budget issue. That's not a policy issue, but it is. Anytime that you're going to influence a budget or a policy, you're lobbying. And that includes if your organization supports a ballot initiative by endorsing that, then you are lobbying. And there's a lot that you can do. I know elections are coming up, but there's a lot that you can do to get involved during an election year. Okay, so there are 4 legal ways in which the IRS defines nonprofits as engaging in lobbying activity. The first is taking a position on a piece of legislation, right? And we said legislation is any law that is in the process of being made, whether it's a budget item or a policy item. The second way that you engage in lobbying is you communicate with lawmakers, right? You tell them, we want to repeal this, we want to create this. You directly communicate with the lawmakers, you are lobbying. If you tell the public how to vote, you are lobbying. And if you urge the members of your nonprofit to vote a certain way, then you're lobbying. So these are the 4 ways in which your organization is engaging in lobbying. Okay, now.
Pat, 1 second.
Yes.
Sherry did have a question. At what point should we initiate contact with legislators to build a collaborative initiative?
Well, that is a great question. I want to talk more about that next time, Sherry, because what I want to talk about next Wednesday is really how your organization can launch an effective legislative campaign. So I hope you can tune in next time, or else see the video, because I will cover that then.
And Pat, if you could project your voice a little louder, there's at least one person that's having trouble hearing. I am not. And another person just said they're not having trouble, but just if you could project a little louder.
Okay, I will do so. Okay. So let's look at, so all these 4 activities are lobbying, right? According to the IRS. But you know, the IRS is not known for making things simple. So there are 2 different ways that 501c3s can engage in lobbying. And the first is called the insubstantial test, or the substantial part test. I know it's crazy. And the reason I have this slide is because it's kind of murky and undefined. What the IRS says is the minute your nonprofit is born and blinks into the world, you have the legal right to lobby to an insubstantial amount. You can spend an insubstantial amount of your volunteer time or staff time and resources lobbying. So what do they mean by insubstantial? I have no idea. Why don't I have an idea? Because they've never defined it. And this is what makes people nervous, because what is it? What is it? 2%, 3%, 5%? What is it? Nobody knows, they've never defined it. Now, if you are a church or a synagogue or a mosque or any organization that is established solely for religious purposes, so not a Catholic Charities, which is a social service agency, but a Catholic church, then you only are allowed to be part of this insubstantial type of lobbying. You're not allowed to be part of any other type of lobbying. But for everybody else, you can fill out this form, and it looks a little big on your screen, but it's a really simple one-line form. You only have to fill it out once in the life of your nonprofit. It is called, as you can see in the middle here, a 501H, which I defined it as have at it, have fun, go lobby. And this simple one-line form will open up tremendous doors and flexibility into the ability of your nonprofit to lobby. And no, the IRS is not more likely to audit you if you sign the 501H form. Your accountant will thank you because it will simplify your 990. So it's not more, it's less work on the 990, and you are not more likely to be audited. So if you sign the 501H form, have at it, have fun, go lobby, then you can spend up to 20% of the first $500 million of your annual expenses on lobbying. I mean, just look at this. You have so much latitude that you can do. It's amazing. And what's really important too is when you think about lobbying, it's broken down into two ways. The first is direct lobbying, okay? And direct lobbying is when you go to the lawmaker and you try to influence that person to do something, pass a law, repeal a law, give you money for your programs, your direct lobbying. Or you have grassroots lobbying. And grassroots, a lot of people think their members are their grassroots, but they're not. So members of your organization belong to you, but the grassroots are people who are beyond your immediate members. And those are the two types of lobbying that you can do under the 501H.
Oh, Pat, we do have a few questions.
Yes.
Elizabeth asked, does the lobbying activity include endorsing specific candidates for office?
That is the one thing you can never, ever, ever, ever do. You can never endorse a candidate for office. Now, you can, and during election year, you can hold candidate debates. You can send questionnaires to candidates about their opinions on things. There are rules around those activities, which are really, really simple. So, for example, if you hold a candidate debate, let's say you are an affordable housing group. For some reason that I don't understand, but it's just the rules, you're not allowed to ask every single question about housing. You have to ask something like, what do you think about taxes in our community? And what do you think about transportation, public transportation accessibility? So you're allowed to ask most of the questions on your issue, but not all of them. And if you do a questionnaire, you are not allowed to ask yes, no questions. It's got to be open-ended questions, but you can publish those results on your website and make them available to your members and the grassroots. So just to be clear, and I want to go back a little bit, when you are under this murky insubstantial part test, you're all the time that your board members spend as volunteers lobbying, you have to write that down and add up the hours. All the time that your staff spends, you have to write that down and add up the hours. Obviously, all the hard cash you spend, which you don't need a lot of money to do this, you have to record. When you are under the 501H, you don't have to keep track of that at all. You don't have to keep track of your volunteer time, your staff time you need to track, but it is really simple. So again, all the time you spend doing direct lobbying, when you're talking directly to the deciders, whoever is making that decision for the law. So for example, let's say you're working on a ballot campaign and you want someone to say no on question 25. The people who are going to make the decision are the voters. So you're directly lobbying when you are working on some kind of ballot campaign. And you're reaching out to the grassroots when you want to get people energized to contact their legislators, so any elected official, on an issue that you want to advance. And there's a technical term which is called a call to action. And it's really easy to remember because you're saying to people, call, write, send a postcard, right? Send an email. That's a call to action. So when you are initiating a call to action, you're telling either your own members or the grassroots to lobby. And that's a lobbying activity. So this says, this little chart is entitled, you can see, lobbying ceilings under the 1976 lobby law. And you might say, what's wrong with this woman? Why does she have a 1976 law up on the screen? And that's because the laws that govern nonprofit lobbying activity have not changed since 1976, which is kind of amazing. So what this says basically is you are allowed as a nonprofit to spend all of your lobbying expenditures, your allowable expenditures, on direct lobbying, on contacting the decision makers. You can spend 1/4 on grassroots lobbying. But quite frankly, for the most part, you're going to be engaged in direct lobbying. So this really is not a major hindrance. And you can see how much latitude you have to be able to spend your organization's resources to advance legislation.
Pat, we do have some more questions.
Yes.
So if you could clarify, is call to action considered insubstantial or substantial?
Good. So when you are in that murky insubstantial category, which you really don't want to be in, if you are not a religious institution, you want to file the 501H form. Let me just be crystal clear about that, because the insubstantial part test is so vague and undefined. Plus, you have to count up your volunteer hours. It makes no sense for any 501c3 corporation not to file the 501H election because the H gives you a lot more latitude. So it's very doubtful as if you're under that murky and substantial test, that you would want to do a call for action, because that is raising your visibility and telling people that you're actively engaged in an advocacy campaign. And it's not good to do that unless you file the 501H. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. You want to file the H, it's free, doesn't cost you any money. You never have to renew it. You just do it once in the lifetime of your organization. And it's fabulous. I worked with a nonprofit I won't name. I was telling Emily about this the other day, and they are a fabulous environmental organization. We were doing strategic planning work, and they engage in a lot of lobbying, and they didn't know they had to file their 501H. Whoops. So I told them, they did. But the beautiful thing about it is, for these limits, these dollar limits of what you're allowed to spend, if you exceed them in any given year, it's really no big deal, because the IRS gives you 4 years to average out your money. So on your expenses. So it's good. It's, you know, it's a good thing to watch, but the 501H gives you this blanket of protection, because there's a lot more that you can do as a nonprofit when you have the 501H.
So a few more questions came in. So some people are just, I think, a little confused between the 501H versus the 501c3, because some say that some funders require the 501c3. So would H qualify us for their funds?
Okay, let me answer that question. Every charity that is incorporated in the nonprofit sector is a 501c3 corporation. So that's the designation that the IRS gives you. So it doesn't matter if you're a little dance troupe or a ballet company or the Red Cross or Children's Hospital. Each of those corporations is called a 501c3. The 501H is an add-on. So that's something, it's a designation that your 501c3 can choose to elect. It's called the H election. Was there another question, Cynthia?
Yes. Is the 501H a federal filing?
Yes, it's a federal filing, and I'll go back to the form. There it is. That's the whole form. It's huge on your screen, but it is it's a one-line form. So basically you go to your board and say, I think we need to think about this if we want to do any kind of advocacy work, or maybe you've been coloring outside the lines like my client, and you've been doing advocacy work without having the protection of the 501H. So you fill this out online, you file it, you're done, and that is all you need to do.
Okay, so does filing the 501H change your status then?
Nope.
Nope.
You're
Okay.
still a nonprofit. You're still a nonprofit. It's just like if you're a human being, and you need eyeglasses, you get eyeglasses. You're still a human being. It's the same thing with the 501H. You're a nonprofit. You're always a nonprofit, but the 501H are your eyeglasses.
Okay, so with the 501H filing, do organizations need to do any specific filing in specific states, or can they lobby locally at city, state, county level?
It depends on your state, and you have to check with your local laws to see what's required. Usually the laws are pretty generous. I know, for instance, in the city of San Diego, you're required to register as a lobbyist if you contact a legislator. I think it's 10 times in a month or something like that. So you have to just look to see what the laws say in your area. But this is just on the federal side, and this just has to do with your nonprofit tax exempt status.
Would this change donations in any way from being deductible? Okay.
Nope, not at all.
And we did have another question from Tara that they ask, is volunteer time calculated toward the monetary cap related to insubstantial activity? And if yes, how is that calculated?
I think it is if it's insubstantial activity and you have to, add up the volunteer hours. What you would do is if you Google, there are figures that will tell you the value of a volunteer hour. And last time I looked, it was, I think, something like $22 an hour or something like that. But to avoid having to do all of that, you just fill out this one line 501H and you don't have to count any volunteer time. Okay. All right, I'm going to move forward. Now, there are some people, and I don't know if this happens to you, who ring my doorbell, obviously, always when I'm having dinner, and say they'd like me to do something. They might be canvassing for the environment, let's say. So if someone rings your doorbell and says, hi, I work for XYZ environmental organization, and this is what we stand for, and this is what we do. And you'd say, oh, that sounds wonderful. And would you be willing to give us money to support our work? None of that is lobbying. If they say to you, and would you be willing to sign this petition, then they are lobbying. Because they have, if you go back and you think about the call to action, they've asked you to do something. Call, write, right? Whatever, to take action, then it's lobbying. So the thing to remember about lobbying is if you have direct contact with the decision maker, and the decision maker could be an elected official, or it could be a member of the community who is voting on a ballot question, then your organization is engaging in lobbying. Now, under the 501H, if you sign that magical form, you are not lobbying when you're influencing regulations. Now, all of these things that I'm going to go over right now would count under that murky and substantial test. But if you sign the 501H form, it's like a get out of jail free card. So if you're influencing regulations, you're communicating with your members. So you're saying to the members of your environmental group, we are fighting really hard to advance this environmental justice legislation. You're not lobbying. When you're testifying, now there's a little bit of caveat about this. The world works according to committees. And if I had to make a guess, I would say that every single person who is zooming into this webinar has served on one kind of committee or another. So if the committee asks you to prepare testimony as an expert, which many of you are because of the work that you do as volunteer leaders or as professional leaders, anytime you testify at the request of a committee, you're not lobbying, including all the time that you've spent researching and preparing your remarks. So this is really, really important because, again, under the murky and substantial test, all of that time you would spend writing up your testimony, driving or flying to the state capitol, all of those costs, that would all go towards your lobbying limits. This, you wouldn't even have to count. You wouldn't have to track any of this, okay? When you discuss broad social and economic issues, so for instance, at your annual meeting, you can't say we're working on Senate Bill 125, but you can say we're working very hard to advance this important legislation that would bring art to public schools. Because art in public schools is really important, and then you can talk about that. Doing nonpartisan research, which is really important, and I'm going to talk more about this next week, because I'm going to talk about how to do the research and how to position your issue so that it's you can make a convincing argument. So all that time that you spend doing research doesn't even count. And self-defense lobbying, which isn't exactly what it sounds like, but self-defense lobbying is when the government decides that they're going to institute a rule that's going to affect a whole swath of nonprofits. So let's say a city says, we're going to decide that nonprofits will no longer be exempt from paying real estate taxes. That would be pretty bad. So you can lobby in defense of that, because it will affect your ability to function as a nonprofit corporation. Now, as I talked about earlier, one thing you can never, ever, ever do is endorse a candidate for office. You can't endorse a candidate. You can't link, your website to your favorite candidate's portal. You can't do that. There is so much that nonprofits can do during an election year. And if you haven't been doing it this year, I hope you'll get ready for the next election, because this is so powerful and important. The most important thing you can do is register people to vote. And even if you are a church or a synagogue or a mosque, you can register people to vote. It doesn't even count towards any of your lobbying limits. So that's a really, really important thing you can do. You can also give people rides to the polls. And again, you can do this as a church or a synagogue or a mosque or any other kind of religious institution. And that does not count towards your lobbying limits. Now, one thing you cannot do is say, hop in my car, let's go to the polls so we can vote for Libby for senator. Can't do that. Can't bring people to the polls to vote for a specific candidate, but you can give them a ride to the polls just so they can vote. It's really important during an election year, and I hope many of you have already done this or you've thought about doing this, is to give the candidates a tour of your nonprofit if there's something to see. If there's nothing to see, just meet with each and every candidate to tell them about your organization, because you ideally want to establish a relationship with a lawmaker before you're asking them to do anything. You just want them to get to know you and who you are and the kind of work you do. That is really important. One thing we talked earlier, and I think I've got another slide too about candidate debates, is you have to make sure if you're doing outreach to the candidates, you have to reach out to all of the viable candidates who are running for office. If there is a fringe candidate who has very little support, you don't need to talk to that person. But any viable candidate, you must reach out to every one of them because that is the law. Now, money is the key to everything in life. And I know very early on, somebody wrote in with a question that said, maybe it was you, Sherry, how do I fund this? How do I get the money to do this kind of work? Well, membership dues and donations. So any kind of, if you have a membership to your organization, you can use all of that money towards these lobbying limits. Special events, you could have a Mama's Kitchen is having a pie sale right now for Thanksgiving. So you can have a gala, you can have a pie sale, you can do whatever kind of special events and use that money. Foundations.
Sorry. Elizabeth had a question about inviting elected officials to events, if that is considered lobbying the elected official.
It's not considered lobbying them, but you must invite all of the officials to the event. You cannot cherry pick. And it probably, let me take that back, Elizabeth. I think it would be considered lobbying just because you're having direct contact with them, even if you're not asking for something specific. So I would count it towards lobbying just to be on the safe side. Foundations can give you money for lobbying. And I was a nonprofit executive for many, many years. And I received many letters from foundations that said none of this money can be used towards lobbying. And that, I'm going to use a really technical term now, that's because those people were stupid heads. There is no reason for a foundation to ever restrict their money. Now, foundations can give you operating support that you can use for lobbying. They can even directly fund a lobbying campaign as long as they don't fund 100% of it. So if they fund 60% of it and the other 40% of it is from another foundation, you're good. If they fund 60% of it and the other 40% is from membership dues and events, you're good. Community foundations are actually 501c3 corporations, so they're public charities, so they can spend quite a bit of money on this. Now, one thing, I call this the DOS slide, and the reason this is called the DOS slide is because you can never, ever, 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 ever use government money to lobby the government. Duh. Okay, so you can't use a city grant to lobby the state or federal money to lobby the city or state, just no government money. So if you have government contracts, which I know many organizations do, you cannot use any of that money to lobby any branch of government. But as you can see, you have lots of other choices about where money might come from to lobby. Okay, so what I'm going to wrap this up and then I'm going to allow time for more questions and answers. I want you all to think very carefully, strategically about making the 501h election. I want to encourage you to do that. I want you to have those meetings where you're really thinking very carefully about what is your mission and how could the mission of your nonprofit be advanced through some kind of legislative activities. You want to have systems in place so that you can track your time. Again, if you file the 501h, there's a lot less to track. And I want to encourage you, I don't know if you all know about Alliance for Justice, but Alliance for Justice is a national organization. I work very closely with them. They're wonderful people. They have a lot of materials on lobbying and lobbying rules. And they also have, and I really love this, a free hotline. So you can call them and say, is this a call to action or not? Can I email this? Will you look at this? And they'll answer it for you. So they're attorneys, they're wonderful, and they will guide you and walk you off the ledge of anxiety for any of the things that you are concerned about in terms of the rules. They've got a lot of handouts, but these rules are really simple. They're not difficult. Okay, I know it feels like bungee jumping. It's a little bit scary, but you can do this. When I started lobbying as a nonprofit exec, I didn't know anything. I just made it up and I learned how to do it. And then I started teaching other people how to do it so that I could hopefully empower other people. So some of you know I've written a new book that's called The Empowered Citizen's Guide. It's 10 Steps to Passing a Law That Matters to You. And this book, actually the appendix of the book, has a chapter that my friends at the Alliance for Justice have carefully reviewed that explains all of the laws for nonprofit lobbying and really, I think, makes it easy to follow. And this book, the heart of this book, is based on this very simple 10-step framework that I put together that teaches people how to pass a law, just going from one step to the next. And that is what I will be talking about when we meet next week. Again, my website is patlibby.com, and there are a lot of resources, free resources on it. I have blogs. There's a discount code if you're interested in buying my book. I'm sure you could look it up on Amazon and read a few pages if you want to see it. And again, I'll talk more about that next week when we get into the meat about how do I begin to think about a campaign, and what does that even mean, and what does that look like, and what do I do? Okay, so I'm going to stop the share and open it up for more questions. What I got, Cynthia? Anything? Oh, good. Thanks, Sherry.
If anybody wants to ask Pat questions, if you want to write them down in the chat, we have one from MJ that says, what are similarities and differences between local, state, and federal lobbying?
Hi, MJ. Thanks for asking that. You know, it's really simple. They're very, very similar. The Empowered Citizens Guide is focused on passing a law at the local and state level. But also next week when we meet, I'm going to walk you through really in about 4 slides how a bill becomes a law so that you can see what the process is. I think that's the part that makes people most nervous, because people think there's all this legal language, there are all these words that they use, I don't know what they mean, and it seems very intimidating. But you have to get over that, because you just have to know about your issue, and you have to know the broad outlines of how the lobbying process, the legislative process works. So we'll talk about that next week, but there are more similarities than there are differences.
Thank you, Pat.
There's very little that you need to track, Andy. It's mostly staff time in terms of what you need to track on the 501H. So you can even, it's very interesting, if you have the 501H, you can even loan a staff member up to 10% of their time working on an actual ballot measure campaign, for instance. So there's all kinds of things you can do. You just want to make sure you're not going over that time limit. But there are fewer things that you have to track if you file the 501H versus if you don't. If you don't, then you've got to track your board's time. So anytime a board member goes to testify or spends time writing up testimony or spends a day going from here to there, where we are in San Diego, our state capitol is a plane ride, or it's a good 8-hour or 10-hour car ride. So all of that time would count. So there's a lot less to track if you file the H. That is the beauty of the H. It gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot less tracking that you have to do. Your accountant will thank you.
Pat, Sophia asked, when does lobbying become a threat to the mission outside of electioneering?
When does it become a threat? Well, you're not lobbying. I don't know, maybe I'm being naive. I really don't think it becomes, I suppose, for instance, if you are lobbying for instance, gun control. You are going to have politicians that will view your organization as hostile to them if you lobby for gun control. If there are governments that are giving you money and you think, well, I'm not going to have money to serve my people I serve because I'm being outspoken on this issue, then I suppose it can become a threat. But for the most part, I think that the opportunity to create change is really powerful, and you'll accomplish a lot more by engaging in lobbying than not. Because there's a lot you can do. There are a lot of resources. And, if you go back to the example that I gave you at the beginning with serving seniors, working with the county to establish this shallow rent subsidy for seniors who are spending more than 50% of their income on rent, keeping seniors or anyone housed is a lot more cost efficient than having people be homeless and then having to find them new homes and rehome them. Building affordable housing is hugely expensive, and housing insecurity is becoming epidemic around the country. So I think for the most part, you can find ways that make lobbying and advocacy very integral into your mission. One thing I didn't talk about earlier, which I want to mention, and I always use this example, is the difference between advocacy and lobbying. So, and the example I always use, because people get it right away, is MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Thanks to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, everybody knows what a designated driver is, right? They coined that phrase, just brilliant, brilliant. But then they also passed laws putting the alcohol limits to 0.08 in all 50 states. That's lobbying. So advocacy is really raising these ideas, and lobbying is moving to affect change through the legislative process.
Thank you, Pat. There was one more question, or two more questions. If a board member wants to lobby full-time, does he or she have to relinquish their role on the board temporarily and then can come back?
No.
No.
No, if they want to lobby full-time as part of what your organization does, it's fine, as long as you have the 501H. Then that person can lobby to an unlimited extent. It's different, there are some organizations I've worked with where you have a board member who is running for political office. Now, that makes things very complicated because a nonprofit cannot endorse a candidate who's running for political office and cannot give them any resources. So if I'm running for office and I'm in a board meeting and I'm on my phone and I'm using the email, the Wi-Fi of the office to send messages, that's not legal. So the only time you want a board member really to step down is when they are running for political office, because it's too complicated and you cannot endorse.
Thank you. Lisa had a question. Do individuals within a volunteer organization or 501c3 need to register as lobbyists in a state, or can the organization register?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think that the individual does have to register on behalf of the corporation. But again, I would check the state and local rules to see what they say, because all the states are different and all the cities and municipal governments are different. So I would double check that. I hope that you are inspired I really want, and for those of you who missed the beginning, where only 3% of nonprofits are actively engaged in lobbying and advocacy, I want to make that at least 30% during my lifetime. You can be part of that change. There's so much important work that we need to do, and I hope you feel inspired to do it. I have, again, there are other videos on my website. I look a lot younger in those, and other free resources that are on my website that you can take a look at and share. And I hope to see you all next week for part 2.